about that PSC rate going up. And so with that, I will be supporting this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Seaborn. Any other comments? Motion. So thank you again to staff and the agency for all of the work that they've put into this meeting and the analysis and fielding tough questions in the midst of some considerable limitations and unknowns. Also like to thank the testifiers for sharing their valuable perspectives and Ms. Baker for the motion. A lot of council members have already articulated some of my perspectives on this issue, and I think I would just want to echo a message that I heard from Ms. Kimball about the significance of some aspects of this motion and the amount of work that it's going to take to really work through some of the aspects of what we've talked about over the last couple of days and addressing bottom contact in a meaningful way. And some of the intent and conversations that have been shared over the last couple of days, I do think that this motion will lead to very meaningful changes in fishery management for our future, or has the potential to. And I appreciate all of the work, and I think the struggles that the council has tried to work through to really find something within our framework to be respectful of the ongoing research and all of the initiatives that have been undertaken by the foundation as well as industry. So with that, I think we're ready for a roll call vote. Mr. Witherell.
Calling the roll on the amended main motion to take no further action at this time on this issue, but to initiate a discussion paper on incentivizing pelagic trawl gear innovation. Mr. Jensen.
Yes.
Ms. Kimball.
Yes.
Mr. Kurland.
Yes.
Mr. Mesereau.
Yes.
Mr. Sukata.
Yes.
Mr. Twite.
Yes.
Ms. Vanderhoven.
Yes.
Mr. Seaborn.
Yes.
Ms. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Down.
No.
Ms. Drobnica.
Yes.
Motion passes 10-1.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think any further action on this agenda item? No. Okay. So with that, we'll take our mid-afternoon break, come back at 3:15, and we will begin our staff presentation on C3. Thank you.
Council members, please come back to order. We are beginning our staff presentation on C3, the Cook Inlet Salmon Status Determination and Specifications. So we have Dr. Watson with us, council staff, to introduce this agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and council members. Nicole Watson, council staff. I'm joined today by Doug Duncan and Dr. Richard Brunner for the presentation, and Gretchen Harrington will also be available for questions. At this meeting, the council is being asked to review the 2024 SAFE report. Sorry, as soon as I figure out how to advance the slides. That is not it. Help, Sarah. Thanks. Okay. At this meeting, the council is being asked to review the 2024 SAFE report for the salmon fisheries of the Cook Inlet EEZ, approve the SAFE report, and to recommend final 2024 harvest specifications, including the tier level for each stock and appropriate buffers as recommended by the SSC. The OFL and ABC for stocks is recommended by the SSC, and the TAC for each species. You already did. The information on the specifications table here is available to you to provide additional guidance in recommending a TAC. The SSC recommendations are shown to help inform your recommendation, and your action is to provide a recommended TAC for cumulative sockeye based on the 3 stocks listed in the table, and for Chinook, coho, chum, and pink salmon. And with that, I will turn it over to Doug and Dr. Brunner.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the council. For the record, my name is Doug Duncan. I'm staff with National Marine Fisheries Service. And today we'll be doing a walkthrough of the Cook Inlet salmon harvest specifications. So very first run through of this process at the council. So we'll be taking a little bit of extra time at the end of before we dig into the meat of the SAFE to give a little process update, as well as go over management context. And then Rich will take it from there. So again, as this action is unconventional in a lot of ways for this council and for NIMS, that also applies to the process. So just to reorient people with where we're at, we had a proposed rule for the amendment to the FMP published on October 19th. We received public comments through that through December 18th. We ended up receiving 88 comments in total. It represented a very diverse range of perspectives and input on the rule. We also, during the proposed rule comment period, we also received requests for tribal consultation. This was a major topic of discussion when both the SSC review and the AP review of this action at this meeting. So I'll be pausing to provide just a little bit more description of what that consisted of. Anyway, at the proposed rule stage currently, at this time, the final rule is being finalized and will be published no later than May 1st of 2024 in compliance with the applicable court orders. At this meeting, we are recommending proposed harvest specifications, but the final harvest specifications will be published in the Federal Register after the final rule, the FMP amendment and implementing final rule for Amendment 16 are published in the Federal Register. And then commercial fishing is scheduled to begin in June of 2024. Okay, so I think most folks are familiar with the standard public comment process for rulemaking. We also have an obligation as a federal agency for tribal consultation. This was, and we've been providing updates on our tribal consultation efforts on this action and others in the B2 report, and it's also outlined here at the B2 report provided at this meeting. But specific to the Cook Inlet salmon action, This kind of work on tribal outreach for this began prior to the April 2023 council meeting, which was when the council was originally scheduled to take final action on Amendment 16 to the Salmon FMP. So we conducted outreach in advance of this. As a result, we held 3 tribal engagement meetings to provide information to interested tribes, as well as 3 tribal consultations. Then the April 2023 council meeting occurred. And once it became, once NIP determined that they would have to prepare a secretarial amendment after the April 2023 council meeting, we then offered a subsequent opportunity for tribal consultation to get feedback from tribes before that proposed rule was developed. At this time, we didn't have any no tribes accepted this opportunity for tribal consultation. So we continued on with the development of the proposed rule. And then in the proposed rule comment period, we then received during and after it, I believe 5 requests for tribal consultation coming out of that. As under the federal rulemaking process, there's, and I guess this situation in particular, given the very tight court deadline of May 1st. But at the end of the proposed rule comment period, there was a very limited ability to conduct tribal consultations and to be able to substantively incorporate any feedback from those consultations. Given the limited ability to make significant changes to a rulemaking between proposed and final rule. However, NIMS has talked to these tribes and is committed to honoring the consultation requests related to interests in a tribal or subsistence salmon fishery in the Cook Inlet EEZ in the coming months through a separate action. So not as a part of Amendment 16, but a subsequent potential follow-on action. Or I guess I'll pause there. I think that kind of, unless Mr. Curlin would like to add anything related to that, just pause for questions briefly before moving on.
Seeing none, thank you.
Okay, so this begins the management context of the presentation. So just that the TAC is one of our primary management tools, but just reiterating how that integrates with the rest of the proposed rule. So all this content will be unchanged from what was presented to the council at their December meeting when the agency provided an overview of Amendment 16. But also noting that this is still at the proposed rule stage, and we are reviewing all the public comments we received, and we'll be publishing a final rule prior to May 1st that may include minor adjustments to some of these proposed measures. But since that has not been finalized, as that's not something to speak to at this time. So as laid out in the proposed rule, the commercial fishery in the Cook Inlet EEZ will occur over a defined fishing season from approximately June 19th to August 15th. Over this period, there will be 2 scheduled fishing periods per week, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Until the season ends on August 15th or closed by NIMS. And so this is and then the areas open during these periods are all federal waters of Upper Cook Inlet, which are kind of defined by that dark, mostly red polygon. And this is similar to the general area open to the drift gill net fleet under state management when area 1 is open. So thinking a little bit about tax setting, under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, we are required to set annual catch limits as well as a tool to as well as management measure to implement them. Yeah, I guess I paused briefly because I think there may be a question on my last statement.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Twain.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Can you remind me whether the proposed rule contains any prohibitions against landing your fish or selling your fish within federal waters, or what, if there's any kind of landing restrictions in the proposed rule? I know you covered this and I just apologize. I can't remember.
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Dwight, through the chair. The proposed rule does prohibit landing or transferring fish in federal waters. And I do have one slide coming up here that will run through some of the other prohibitions identified for the fishery. Okay, so getting back to tax. So again, as we've been grappling with under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, we are required to establish annual catch limits and management measures to implement them. The tool for doing so is a total allowable catch that would close the fishery when reached. As applicable to Cook Inlet, a TAC would, since we do not have in-season genetic information to determine multiple stocks of the same species in real time, a TAC would be set for each individual salmon species, considering the contribution of the individual component stocks. And I think Dr. Brenner will get more into that in his part of the presentation. And then just generally, the TAC must be set at a level equal or below the ABC recommendation of the SSC, and may also include reductions to account for ecosystem requirements, management uncertainty, as well as social and economic considerations. So thinking about how this would work. So once the fishery enters those periods of scheduled openings, NMFS will be monitoring the commercial fishery daily, looking at what the amount of effort that's occurring, how many vessels are participating, what amount of fish is being landed on a daily basis, and the NMFS would close the EEZ to commercial fishing when there's a number of different potential scenarios. The number one is if a TAC is reached. Number two, NMFS in-season managers also have the flexibility to close in the event that they get information that indicates that overfishing is occurring, even if a TAC has not been reached. So a precautionary closure authority. And then if there's neither one of these things occur during the course of the normal season, commercial fishing would close automatically on August 15th.
Mr. Curlin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Duncan, I know there've been a number of questions from stakeholders about how quickly we can close the fishery in season. I wonder if you might just address that.
Through the chair, yes, Mr. Curlin, that was part of my intent here, and I forgot, so I'll go back over it. So under our requirements with the Administrative Procedures Act, we have to provide notice in the Federal Register of fishery closure for effectiveness. In order to do this, there is between a 1 and 4 day delay from the time a management decision is made to the time a fishery is closed. I think on average, it generally takes 1 to 2 days to do this, but depending on if there's a intervening weekend and the timing that a decision is made during a day, you could end up with one of the longer period up to a maximum of 4 days.
Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is just opposite of Mr. Curlin's. If you have a large pulse of fish and you're seeing that in your fisheries, can you liberalize time and able to use those fish that are coming through instead of letting them go through and over escaping the systems. It's
Through the chair, Mr. Jensen. So that was something that we plan to talk a little bit about on the next slide. So again, I guess starting if we have the opposite scenario, which is obviously a major concern, if we have fewer fish returning than forecasted, we do have the authority to close early under this proposed rule. If the alternate happens, which I think we all hope that more fish come back, then less. NIMS, obviously fishing can continue up to the original TAC amount specified. Depending on the time frame, we may also be able to adjust the TAC upwards to allow more fishing opportunity, but again, not to exceed the ABC recommended by the SSC and the harvest specifications. But no, under the proposed rule, we don't have the flexibility to add additional fishing periods per week.
Yes, Mr. Jensen.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, follow up to that, I didn't. So if the season is 1 or 0 to 2 million prediction for the salmon season that year, and then all of a sudden it goes into like a 2 to 4 million fish season, you're stuck with the TAC that was set at the start of the year. So you can't harvest the fish, the huge excess of fish because of that TAC that was set before the season started for the ABC.
Through the chair, Mr. Jensen, we could adjust the TAC upwards, but we could not adjust the TAC above the ABC that had been originally set in the harvest specifications. So I guess that would be the ceiling.
Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Duncan, can you remind me how NIMS will know whether either fewer or more fish return than forecasted?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's a good question. So in season, our managers are looking at all available sources of information. I think in this situation, the likely pieces that they'll be focusing on are obviously any escapement information that we can obtain from how that's progressing through the season. Any information, there is a test fishery that is operated by the state, any information we can get from that. And then as well as comparing, looking at our catch per unit effort in the federal fishery and comparing that to historical catches. So how the run appears to be developing compared to prior years.
So you'll be essentially using models based on some forms of in-season data to estimate a different run size. And the reason I'm asking that is that at least typically, I think in Alaska, but certainly in the lower 48, those models are usually go through at least some amount of statistical review prior to their use. And so I'm sort of curious about the development of models that are sort of sufficiently robust.
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Twite, I think that's definitely a consideration, and I don't want to, but yes, I'm not currently aware of what model we would use, just that would be a tool available to our managers if they find one that is sufficiently accurate. But it'll probably also be an iterative development process to I guess to develop that. And I know Dr. Brenner has some expertise with that, so I'll see if he has anything to add.
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, I will note that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has for sockeye salmon, at least an in-season model that they use to project overall run size for select sockeye salmon stocks in season. I could also offer that unfortunately that model seems to coalesce with a valid number in late July, so pretty late in the season. You know, to no fault of anybody's, it's just the way that the numbers work. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Sakata.
Yes, thank you through the chair. What is the process for adjusting TAC upward? I noticed that, in the PowerPoint, it talks about things like, considering impacts to other stock and fishery participants. I guess really what I'm getting at is how fast can the TAC be adjusted upward or downward?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Mr. Sakata. I believe that there's typically I want to say a 14-day comment period associated with adjusting the TAC. So it would take some time. It may not be able to be implemented as quickly as wanted in some situations.
Just for clarification, so there's a 14-day comment period. Okay, so 2 weeks minimum. Is it 2 weeks and a day? What is the other processes? I'm still confused to maybe what an average time might be. So what would be, okay, let me rephrase. My first question, what is the process? What steps would you take to adjust the TAC?
Through the chair, Mr. Sakata, thank you for the question. So I think immediately on receiving that information, in-season managers would publish a notice in the Federal Register of a TAC adjustment, as well as their proposed increases. And then after receiving the public comments on that, then would make a decision at the conclusion of that comment period whether to increase the TAC or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Mesereau?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for walking us through this. I was wondering if there's any prohibition with federal management to allow the fishermen to conduct a test fishing period, or are there restrictions for that? If you don't have adequate information to determine that the run is weak, can you allow them to go out and fish and see if they're there, or is there no provision for doing that? You'd only use the state's ability to conduct a test fishery.
Through the chair, Mr. Mesereau, I guess there are, NOAA authorizes test fisheries through letter of authorization. Usually that's a separate from the commercial fishing. There's not that specifically proposed as a part of this action, but so it would not be precluded necessarily from being implemented in the future.
Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Just thinking through a little bit further on Mr. Sakata's question about reopening and the timeline there. It's my recollection from other issues that we've taken up. It's kind of like 1 or 2 days to get it into the Federal Register. And then do you need, after you've made your decision after the comment period, do you need to put it in the Federal Register again? I'm just thinking, so 2 weeks plus these couple of days, there's probably a weekend in there. Is it realistically closer to 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks? And looking at how short the fishery, how realistic is it that would actually happen?
Through the chair, Ms. Vanderhoven, I think that's probably a reasonable comment to make. I don't, off the top of my head, know exactly how many additional days might be added, but I know in the analysis, that was definitely identified as a concern, is that there's a lot of situations where it may not be the most practicable tool.
Thank you. I think we're ready to continue.
Okay, I think we covered that fairly thoroughly. And then just to go on to the other requirements associated with vessels and how we would be getting catch information and to use in our management. So will be issuing a federal permit required to participate in the fishery, and participants will have to maintain a federal logbook as well as a VMS system. And the VMS system will provide important information to managers about how many vessels are participating in each opening, as well as the locations of where they're fishing to make sure they're compliant with open areas. And then as Mr. Dwight mentioned earlier, prohibiting landing of salmon in EEZ waters is prohibited. So any participants landing salmon in the state of Alaska, which we expect will be everybody, would still be required to have the applicable state of Alaska CFEC permit card to participate in the fishery.
Mr. Jensen.
I didn't know if it was out of questions yet or not, but I have another one, if you would indulge me. It says you have to have a CFEC permit to land salmon in Alaska. What's to say that you land salmon to a floater and he takes them out of Alaska, like down to Washington, delivers them? Does he have to have any special permit for that? You don't, I mean, you're catching them in federal waters and you're delivering them in a different state. Is that going to change things?
Through the chair, Mr. Jensen, it's my understanding that since delivering salmon in EEZ waters is prohibited, they would have to deliver to a floating processor operating in state waters, in which case it would still be, it would then be subject to the state permit requirements.
My question is if he's taking them offshore out into the EEZ, that wouldn't be in state waters. Could he, the floater processor, take him from the EEZ to somewhere else without any state interaction?
Mr. Jensen, since landing or transferring of salmon is prohibited in EEZ waters, I don't think that's a risk. I think what is generally contemplated, and this has been discussed in other salmon actions, is that in order to land salmon in a different state, they would have to transit through EEZ waters from Cook Inlet. It's down to the nearest state, which is Washington, without ever contacting or stopping for fuel or supplies or anything within the state. That's, I think, considered logistically implausible. Okay, continuing onward. We talked about the vessel requirements and now, but in order to get the landings data, we are requiring the processors and anybody receiving deliveries of Cook Inlet salmon to have a federal permit. And then they would be required as a condition of the permit to report through e-landings by noon of the following day. So in order to get information on catch as soon as possible, this was the identified approach. And then the list of prohibitions, again, this has most of them are focused on the catch accounting piece, given that this is a separate fishery from the state waters salmon fisheries and that we're managing to a federal TAC. Fishing in both state and EEZ waters on the same calendar day would be prohibited, as well as discarding salmon would be prohibited. And then, as we discussed, landing or transferring fish in the EEZ, as well as processing salmon at sea. Moving on to the recreational sector, this is a extremely small amount of estimated removals, with an annual average of 66 fish of all salmon species per year harvested by the marine sport fishery in this area. So it's relatively limited management measures. All waters would be open and bag limits consistent with the current state of Alaska bag limits for the area would be established. It also would be prohibited from combining say state and EEZ limits on board to I guess, increase the catch of salmon. And then the assessment would be looked at by information available postseason in order to inform the harvest levels for this extremely small fishery sector. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brenner. Oh, don't get away that easy.
Thank you, Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Douglas, I'm actually not sure who this question would go to, but I have a question about the amount of agency resources. If the agency has any sort of estimate of what kind of resources it's going to take to implement the management framework that you've described for Upper Cook Inlet. And I'm not asking, we can even set aside the stock assessment safe report process and just the actual regulatory aspects of the fishery and in-season management. Do you have a sense of what kind of resources that's going to consume? And I'm thinking about that question from two different angles. One is just, is there an impact on your groundfish management capabilities in order to provide this, what is necessary for salmon management? And then, so I'll ask it first from that perspective.
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, thank you for the question. There is I can't remember what section of the analysis that talks just a little bit about this. And I think it is estimated at maybe like 2 staff members to two FTE positions to administer the fishery. I know that's something that we're thinking about as building additional capacity to respond to the
Mr. Curlin.
Didn't mean to cut you off, Mr. Duncan. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just say Doug's correct about the estimate of what it would take, but we have received 0 new resources for this. So to get at your question, Mr. Twite, about opportunity costs, yes, it means trade-offs. But given that this is a court-ordered action, something that we must do, we have to find a way to internalize it in the absence of new resources. So it does come at a cost.
Thank you. And I hope to be able to ask the second part of my question in a way that's not misinterpreted, because as somebody who's pretty intimately familiar with salmon management, at least in the lower 48, I know how intensive it is, and that's the right thing. Salmon are highly transitory, information changes rapidly and all that. But as I'm looking at all the constraints that exist in the federal system that just do not exist in the state systems, any state, at least that I know of, that manages salmon, and these aren't your fault or anything else. It's the real world. Why devote those kind of resources to maintaining the potential for in-season management, actual ability to make changes in season when it seems so unlikely? As Dr. Bremer pointed out, and is typical for sockeye, it's really about, at least in the lower 48, you got to get about halfway through the run before your in-season estimates become accurate enough to make changes to your fishery with confidence. You've got a relatively short window. Sockeye move fast. You got a relatively short window. You've got, in order to make some of your changes, like changes to TAC, that's a 2+ week window. At closures, I know you can do more quickly, but any openings, you really, you can't. You effectively have a very small actual chance of being able to make informed, defensible in-season changes to your preseason plan. So given that it comes at a cost to the agency to do that, why even hold out the hope that you can make actual in-season changes to the fishery when it costs you and it costs other fisheries that you have to manage?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, that's a difficult question. I guess I would, we have our management responsibilities under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. I expect that our in-season managers will be cognizant of when, I guess, not waste excess resources on management actions that are not likely to produce the desired outcomes, I guess. And maybe I guess
Mr. Carlin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So through the chair, Mr. Twite, our in-season management team will be responsible for this along with everything else they're responsible for. So I wouldn't picture the Maytag repairman sitting by waiting for salmon information. These are people who are going to be actively managing other fisheries, who will have to make way for making decisions relative to the salmon fisheries as those issues come up. So they would be fully subscribed with other duties when they're not managing this fishery.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, I also just want to emphasize, we're just talking about the suite of regulatory possibilities. So these same authorities exist for groundfish, but it's not common that we would use our regulatory authority to adjust attack in season. It's a possibility. So I think he's acknowledging that it's possible. It's within our authority to do so. It would require rulemaking, so it's unlikely. So I think, more likely in-season authority is just closing fishery. That's the thing we don't need rulemaking for. It's a notice. But the agency always has the rulemaking authority to make an adjustment. It's as you've noticed, it's unlikely to be useful here because of the time it would take.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I guess the only other thing that I'll add to that is, as Mr. Kurland alluded to, in addition to the in-season management needs for the fishery, I think it's also contemplated that these staff would work on any needed FMP amendments or regulatory amendments that are identified as we get into management of the fishery. And I think that concludes my portion, unless there's any other questions.
Seeing none, thank you.
All right,
Sure.
thank you. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Rich Brenner with the National Marine Fisheries Service. And I'm going to provide what will be a very high level overview of the 2024 Cook Inlet Salmon Stock Assessment and Fishery Evaluation Report, the SAFE report. And we think it's important to start off by acknowledging that referenced within the 2024 SAFE report is an extensive environmental assessment and regulatory impact review, the otherwise known as the analysis. And this includes social and economic analyses, considerations for subsistence, personal use, sport, and commercial fishers, affiliated businesses, and communities. It also includes a description of the methods, estimates, and assumptions that were used in the SAFE report, and including how it is that we have estimates of historical harvest in the Cook Inlet EEZ when there has yet to be a Cook Inlet EEZ fishery. So that's all in this more than 530-page analysis. And just as a reminder, of course, it was presented to the council in April of last year, and status determination criteria were also presented in 2019. The goals of the SAFE report is to provide information needed to manage the federal salmon fisheries in the Cook Inlet EEZ area as per National Standard 1 guidelines, to recommend harvest specifications while preventing overfishing. And similarly, the goal of this presentation is to provide information to set TAC for the Cook Inlet EEZ and provide updated recommendations from the SSC. So in the SAFE report, the salmon stocks are assessed via a tier system that's based on available information, with the tier 1 is the highest available information. These are salmon stocks with escapement goals and stock specific harvests. Tier 2 stocks are somewhat similar to tier 1 stocks, but they are stock complexes with specific salmon stocks as indicator stocks to assess status determination and harvest specifications. Tier 3 stocks are salmon stocks with no reliable estimates of escapement or total run size. And so the tiers define the methods used for both harvest specifications and status determination criteria. So as a broad overview for tiers 1 and 2, to set the ABC in the SAFE, we start off with a total run size forecast. And from this, the escapement target is subtracted from that. And then projected state harvests are subtracted off of that as well. And then that quantity is reduced by a buffer to address scientific uncertainty to result in the ABC. For tier 3 stocks, the ABC is set in a very different manner. We start off with the maximum historical EZ harvest for an entire generation, and then that value is reduced by a buffer. In terms of status determination criteria, overfished is assessed for all stocks with escapement goals as a point by which actual realized escapements are half of the escapement target for a generation. Overfishing is assessed differently between the tiers 1 and 2 versus the tier 3 stocks. And it's assessed based on exceeding the maximum fishing mortality rate for tiers 1 and 2, and then based on historical max catch for tier 3. But again, as we'll say a couple of times, since there's been no federal fishery prior to 2024 in the Cook Inlet EEZ, no overfished or overfishing determinations will be assessed for 2024. So starting right off with the stocks themselves, the stock that is probably is the biggest sockeye salmon stock, and that which is has the highest harvest estimates in the Cook Inlet EEZ is Kenai late run sockeye salmon, with a stock definition that matches the federal definition that matches the state definition. And so the SAFE report used extremely high quality Alaska Department of Fish and Game harvest, escapement, genetic stock composition, brood table, and age composition data in the assessment. And just to emphasize that the available data for this stock is really world class, very, very high quality data. As such, the SSC recommended tier 1 status for this stock. And as a tier 1 stock, as mentioned previously, the preseason forecasts are used to predict both the total run size for tier 1 stocks as well as the likely state harvest. The same modeling exercise, the same modeling framework is also used to predict the buffer necessary to reduce the preseason OFL to ABC. Here's a schematic that shows what was just said. Again, starting off with the total run size forecast, escapement targets are subtracted off of that, and then state harvests are subtracted off of that to result in the realized preseason overfishing limit. And then that value is further reduced by a buffer that accounts for both the state harvest, so uncertainty in state harvest, and the buffer also at the same time accounts for scientific uncertainty in the total run size forecast. Kasilof sockeye salmon, again, same high quality data available as for Kenai sockeye salmon, and the federal definition for this stock is also consistent with the state of Alaska definition. As such, the SSC also recommended tier 1 status for Kasilof sockeye salmon stock. Again, same methods were used for harvest specifications for Kasilof. Aggregate other sockeye salmon, this is the first stock complex that we'll mention. This is on page 32 of the SAFE report. And this stock definition, the federal definition, would include all Upper Cook Inlet sockeye salmon harvested in the EEZ, with the exception of Kenai and Kasilof sockeye salmon. It would also, the definition would also include 4 indicator stocks to assess overfish determination. And ADF&G harvest and escapement data and genetic stock composition data were used in the SAFE assessment. In considering the tier status recommendation for aggregate other sockeye salmon, some of the considerations included that there are many unmonitored systems that containing sockeye salmon, as you can see from the map on the screen. There's also some gaps in monitoring for some indicator stocks. And I did not explain this previously, but one necessary component of both tier 1 and 2 salmon stocks for harvest specifications is the need to estimate total run size. And that was both the assessment of the SAFE authors and the SSC that was not possible with this stock. And as such, the SSC recommended tier 3 status for aggregate other sockeye stock complex with 4 indicator systems to assess overfish status. As a tier 3 salmon stock complex, or stock, I should say, again, we start off with the largest harvest in the historical record. This is multiplied by the generation time, which for sockeye salmon, which would be 5 years. From this, the prior years in the generation times, the harvest from the prior years in the generation time are subtracted off to result in a pre-season overfishing limit. So this is the amount that could reasonably be harvested without exceeding the overfishing limit. That's what is represented by the preseason OFL. In the SAFE report, we start off with consideration for a baseline buffer that's the preseason overfishing limit divided by the generation time. So this takes the amount that could reasonably be harvested and puts it on par with a single year harvest, what could reasonably be harvested in a single year. As the SAFE report discusses, we also consider more liberal and more precautionary buffers in the assessment. Moving on to aggregate Chinook salmon, which is another stock complex on page 40 of the SAFE report. This would include any Chinook salmon harvested in the Cook Inlet EEZ, and also include tributaries and drainages known to contain Chinook salmon throughout upper Cook Inlet. Is there a question?
Yes, Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Dr. Brenner, I'm still really struggling to understand the construction of the OFL and how that relates to sort of the basic population health of a salmon population. I'm just some kind of brick wall there or something. So I'm wondering if you can walk through why largest harvest and generation cycle are the 2 ingredients there, because they don't line up for me in terms of population health.
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Twite, thank you for the question. I think that starting with the largest harvest ever is sort of trying to find an analog to the tier 1 assessment method, which tries to explain or tries to tell you what the in the tier 1 method, it's the largest potential yield in the EEZ. That's what's represented in the tier 1 approach. So you take the total run size, subtract off state harvest, and subtract off the escapement target, and what you're left with is maximum potential yield that could be harvested in the EEZ. It's somewhat similar if you think about it for the tier 3 approach. We have less available information though. That's the thing with tier 3 stocks, is there's less available information. the assumption is inherently made with the tier 3 stocks that the largest harvest in history, in the historical time series under consideration, also represents the maximum potential harvest in the EEZ. That as far as I can explain it, is the starting assumption with the tier 3 approach. Tier 1 approach, you'll notice that is also the status determination criteria are also assessed over the course of a generation. So in other words, a stock would have to be overfished. It would have to be below the escapement goal for an entire generation in order for overfish to be determined. Similar for overfishing status as well, also assessed over a generation. So the two tier systems speak to each other in terms of generational assessment. It's just that there's less available information for the tier 3 stock.
That's helpful. Thank you.
And again, I just want to emphasize that our harvest specifications, we searched for a method for tier 3 to try to make it both precautionary and on a single year basis. So, that was our approach, is dividing by the generation time to present in resulting ABC that was what could reasonably be harvested in a single year. So with that, I'll continue. And for aggregate Chinook salmon stocks, again, this would include any Chinook salmon harvested in the Cook Inlet EEZ area and include tributaries and drainages known to contain Chinook salmon throughout Upper Cook Inlet. And as you can see from the map here, that there are a number of tributaries in Upper Cook Inlet with Chinook salmon. So in considering the tier for aggregate Chinook salmon, this would include, the total escapement to the entire stock complex is unknown. Therefore, it was the SAFE recommendation and the SSC recommendation that the total run size is unknown. We'll also note that there's no genetic data that we could find historically from the drift gillnet harvest. And considering those points, the SSC recommended a tier 3 status for aggregate Chinook salmon, with Kenai late run Chinook salmon as an indicator stock to assess overfish status. Of note for Chinook salmon in Upper Cook Inlet and elsewhere is that Chinook salmon are, as many people know, in a low state of abundance throughout the North Pacific right now. There's also 5 state of Alaska stock of concern designations listed here for Upper Cook Inlet Chinook salmon. That being said, 4 of those stocks, I believe, are in the Susitna area. Previous assessments by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game did not find evidence that appreciable quantities of Chinook salmon from that area are harvested in the drift gillnet fleet or fishery based on run timing mismatch. However, again, to emphasize, it's unknown what stocks are harvested in the Cook Inlet EEZ, but the estimates presented in the SAFE report suggest possibly only 51 Chinook salmon, and that's not 5,100, that's 51 Chinook salmon harvested in all of 2023. Moving on to aggregate coho salmon, this is a stock complex definition on page 44 of the SAFE report. This is a definition that would include all coho salmon harvested in the Cook Inlet EEZ area with two indicator stocks, and also include all unmonitored drainages as part of the stock complex definition. Data available to assess this stock include the escapement data from the indicator stocks, as well as Alaska Department of Fish and Game harvest estimates for all harvest components, so recreational, personal use, and commercial components. And there is some genetic stock composition data as well for this stock from the drift gillnet fishery. In terms of a tier consideration for this stock, some of the same considerations exist for aggregate coho as for other sockeye salmon. incomplete escapement monitoring via weirs in some years, although definitely not as extensive, actually, I think it's actually more extensive for this stock than aggregate sockeye salmon. An inability to estimate escapements for the entire stock complex, and therefore an inability to estimate total run size, and possibly a risk as a tier 3 or as a tier 1 or 2 stock. There was a risk of overestimating potential yield based on the tier 2 method. As such, the SSC recommended a tier 3 determination for aggregate coho salmon. Again, emphasizing that there are escapements missing from the 2 indicator stocks or incomplete for both the Deshka River in recent years and for the Little Susitna in recent years for this stock. Also of note is this stock would have been subject to overfishing in 2013 had there been federal management. And of course, again, just to reiterate, there was not. So that's not a valid determination, but it's just for information purposes. Overall, the SAFE report highlights a fair bit of caution warranted in assessing this stock. Again, highlighting incomplete, missing, or escapements that are below the state of Alaska escapement goal. This species is subject to gillnet harvest in the EEZ. Genetic data does show that drift gillnet harvest in the EEZ fish bound for northern Cook Inlet, and it is perhaps noteworthy that the state of Alaska's fishery management plan prioritizes coho passing through the central district where the Cook Inlet EEZ is located. There's also literature suggesting that coho salmon are a preferred prey item of endangered Cook Inlet beluga whales, and prey availability is listed as a medium concern, if I recall correctly, for the Cook Inlet recovery plan. Moving on to aggregate chum salmon, a stock complex definition on page 50 of the SAFE report. This stock definition would include all chum salmon harvested in the Cook Inlet EEZ and include all drainages and tributaries as part of the stock complex definition. There is one state of Alaska escapement goal in Upper Cook Inlet for chum salmon. That's Clearwater Creek. It's assessed via peak aerial survey, and it was the judgment of the NOAA SAFE team that was not necessarily indicative of the overall stock complex. The SAFE report did use recreational, personal use, and commercial harvest components from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. But as there's no reliable estimate of stock complex-wide escapement or total run size, the SSC recommended a tier 3 determination for this stock. Finally, we end the stock assessments with aggregate pink salmon on page 53 of the SAFE report. Not much information is available to assess this stock. It's really just harvest data. There's no escapement goals from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for pink salmon. And again, we used ADF&G harvest estimates, and based on the paucity of information, the SSC recommended tier 3 for this stock as well. Overall recommendations include that estimates of total run size for aggregate coho and aggregate other sockeye salmon in particular could improve confidence in future SAFE recommendations, and better inform estimates of potential yield and risk of those two. Aggregate other sockeye salmon is closer to producing a total run size, and Alaska Department of Fish and Game has produced estimates in recent years, but those total run size estimates were not incorporated into the SAFE assessment. Another recommendation is to improve forecast of salmon run size and run timing for Upper Cook Inlet salmon stocks harvested in the EEZ, which would also inform in-season management. Closing comments, this SAFE is very much a first step with more improvements in the future. Thanks to the recommendations from the SSC. Getting beyond historical estimates, actual harvest in the EEZ, rather than the estimates that we had to use, will provide better information to inform future federal fisheries management. The National Marine Fisheries Service will update the SAFE methods and report to reflect the SAFE report to reflect SSC recommendations, including, we feel importantly, adding a risk table to capture uncertainty not addressed in the stock assessments themselves. In terms of additional uncertainty, it's worth noting that while the buffers to reduce OFL to the recommended ABC do account for scientific uncertainty, that there's also additional sources of uncertainty that were not accounted for in the SAFE report or the recommended ABCs, the ABCs recommended by the SSC. So uncertainties include the number of participants in this very new federal fishery, whether there will be delays in reporting harvests and how that may affect management decisions. There's uncertainty associated with the spatial distribution of fishing that will occur in the EEZ, and it's unknown how that will compare to distribution under state management. There's also uncertainty associated with harvest and harvest rates on stocks given both federal and state fisheries. And there's uncertainty associated, as we discussed previously, with a somewhat less flexible federal management structure. There's also social and economic considerations. So impacts to subsistence, personal use, sport and commercial fishers, affiliated businesses and communities, and also opportunities for other salmon users that could be considered. Finally, there are ecosystem considerations such as the previously mentioned prey availability to Cook Inlet beluga whales, and probably other ecosystem considerations as well that were not explicitly addressed in the 2024 SAFE report. In terms of approach is to setting the TAC, as you well know, the TAC must be less than or equal to the ABC.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I interrupt? Sorry about
Please
that.
do.
I have a couple questions here. I think Mr. Twite and then Ms. Gimbel.
Thanks, Madam Chair and Dr. Brenner. Sorry to interrupt. I just on the ecosystem considerations slide, which I appreciate. I'm wondering if some of the other ecosystem considerations you're thinking about include the role of salmon and transferring marine nutrients into freshwater ecosystems, and also the role of salmon as prey, as juveniles, essentially as bait fish, as juveniles.
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, those are certainly both ecosystem considerations. You know, the role of salmon. Yeah, I think that there are probably pluses and minuses with those considerations. You know, and I think it would be a big discussion to include them. But thank you for bringing them up.
Thank you, Dr. Brenner and Ms. Kimball and Ms. Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brenner. And I was on slide 43, and I just wanted to understand. I think you putting in this slide the accounting for management uncertainty, that seems like a big one, having not had this fishery before. So that's not really accounted for, except, and tell me, I'm asking if I'm getting this correctly, except in your specific choice of the buffers that you put around. I'm wondering where you're capturing the management uncertainty. I assumed it was in the buffers that were chosen between OFL and ABC, or maybe between preseason OFL.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, thank you for the question. we considered additional sources of scientific uncertainty to reduce the OFL to the ABC. These sources of uncertainty here on this slide are explicitly sources of uncertainty that we feel were not captured in our scientific a buffer to reduce OFL to ABC. So unless Doug has anything to offer, I would say these are additional sources of uncertainty beyond that.
Yeah, through the chair, I think that's correct, and contemplated that they would be captured in any buffer recommended between ABC and TAC.
Okay, that's what I was looking for, whether the expectation is that we capture that management uncertainty in the tax setting process. And Josh is waiting. And then my second question is on the social and economic considerations. That's just a little bit thrown in there. And we normally do that and provide for those impacts when we're looking at a regulatory change. Are you suggesting these are things we would consider if there were proposed changes to this fishery down the road, or that these are things that you're trying to accommodate in the next version of a SAFE? I didn't know where these fit.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, thank you for the question. I think these would also fall under tax setting considerations. The ABC to OFL did account for catch or projected catch in state fisheries. But however, I guess some of the uncertainties, other management uncertainties, and then the potential impacts of those to these other fisheries that are also dependent on salmon, but occur later than the salmon fishery in federal waters.
Thank you for that. And so does that mean that information that we should be using to consider these impacts is in our previous EARIR, or is there some other source of information?
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, thank you for the question. Yeah, for this 2024 tax setting, it's contemplated that information is in the EARIR. For subsequent years of the SAFE, we do plan on incorporating the new and updated information into that document.
Thank you.
And Ms. Baker. Through the chair, thank you for the presentation. I had a very similar question to Ms. Kimball's, except for going back to the point under accounting for management uncertainty relative to the note that your SAFE did not account for uncertainty related to harvest and harvest rates on stocks in both federal and state fisheries. And my shorthand for that is harvest and harvest rates on weak stocks, which is, of course, a fundamental focus of state management. So what information in the EARIR should the council use if you're saying that that's a management uncertainty decision? I'm finding it difficult to tease out how that ultimately also isn't scientific uncertainty, but we can talk about that another time. Can you please direct me to the information that the council is supposed to use to incorporate that, what I think is a pretty significant uncertainty?
Through the chair, Ms. Baker, I think I would like to issue a slight clarification and maybe even a correction based on your question. Certainly, in the SAFE report, we do consider state harvests in the sense that we start off with a preseason OFL and for say tier 1 stocks, and we subtract off the lower bound of the spawning escapement goal, and we subtract off the likely state harvest. So state harvests are certainly accounted for in that aspect. They are accounted for in the SAFE report in that way. I think that, and perhaps Doug can chime in here as well, that what this bullet point is trying to get at is that this is a new fishery with both harvests in state waters and federal waters, and we don't exactly know how that's all going to shake out in terms of participation, which is also mentioned as a bullet point, and overall harvest and harvest effort.
Ms. Baker.
Through the chair. Thank you, Dr. Brenner, for that. And I understand that. I guess I'm looking at the page 3 on the SAFE that very clearly says the effects of effort on harvest of weaker stocks, Chinook and coho in particular, are not considered in the SAFE. So do you, and so I'll follow up on what you said, but again, can you suggest any information in the EARIR for Amendment 16? Again, that since the council's going to want to consider that we can look at, do you have a table or anything that you can look at in terms of those estimates of harvest in the EEZ? I'm struggling with how the council is supposed to, if it wanted to take into account the effects of harvest on weak stocks in tax setting.
Through the chair, Ms. Baker, thank you for the question. And thank you also for pointing out weak stocks and I realize that was also a component of your previous question that I didn't mean to gloss over. And it is a very, very important consideration. The issue with weak stocks is by their very nature, as stocks with lower abundance, they are often more difficult to assess because there's less information to assess them. And so that's an inherent problem with trying to account for weak stock management in a large fishery is trying to figure out how to balance harvest on stronger stocks while avoiding harvest on weak stocks. I don't think we have an explicit table that addresses weak stocks, but certainly we do mention stocks of concern in the SAFE report and likely also in the analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I tried to answer your question, but yeah, I'll move on. Thank you.
Excuse me, we have one more question. Mr. Jensen.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is what originated this road path down to this FMP by the people that originated the lawsuit was that their concern was under harvest. And that was the large over escapements into the Kenai and Ceciloff every year over the escapement, higher end of the escapement goal. And is this FMP going to do anything to address that, or is that up to the state to address it inside 3 miles to keep those escapement goals at the levels that they're supposed to be?
Through the chair, Mr. Jensen, I think that's a challenging question and one at the crux of this. As Dr. Brenner talked about, we do begin consideration by looking at all what I guess essentially the maximum potential yield that could be harvested in the EEZ, but then reduce that down by all the buffers to account for the uncertainty so we don't end up in a situation where we do over harvest a stock before we have complete information on it. But
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And let's see, I think we are on slide 45. And not that you need a reminder, but of course, in considering the TAC, it needs to be less or equal to the ABC recommended by the SSC. The TAC may consider a buffer reduction from the ABC for each stock to account for management or uncertainty or other users. Here's the the table, which presents the left-hand side of the table with the top rows in gray. These are the SSC recommendations. The column with the top in blue are the AP recommendations, and as you can see, the TAC column is empty at this point right now for your consideration. And with that, I think we are done with our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll see if there are any last questions for our presenters. Yes, Mr. White.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Dr. Brenner, as we sort of look at the TAC table here, page 46, sockeye are kind of stand out because there's a single TAC for 3 stock complexes. And as we've sort of seen in the numbers you've showed us and heard, two of those are highly productive, large stocks, the Kenai and the Kasilof, and then the aggregate is kind of a head scratcher. My understanding is that there's probably, well, clearly there's a wide range of small populations included in that. And some of them may be highly productive. Some of them are quite probably of low productivity. So we've got a true sort of mixed stock fishery here with stocks of very varying productivities and a single TAC to guide in-season management. When you just sum together the 3 ABCs, the big numbers have the most weight then in the overall TAC. And the big numbers come from the productive stocks. So essentially, it isn't the effective harvest rate that in the AP motion say, isn't that effective harvest rate that's the result of fishing for that TAC? Isn't that really mostly dominated by the numbers for the healthy stocks, and therefore the harvest rate sort of most applicable to a healthy stock? And that if you were to instead manage for the weaker stocks, you would choose a much lower harvest rate and therefore a much lower TAC?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, thank you for the question. I think your question has a lot of areas we could go on that. I don't want to speak too much, but I think it's worth noting that within a drainage like the Kenai, which you classify as a, and I'm certainly not arguing with you, but you classify as a strong stock. There are probably many different spawning aggregates within the Kenai itself, and some of those are probably larger, and some of those are probably smaller. This term weak stock and strong stock is they're convenient terms, but yeah, it's a complicated question that you're posing. I know that from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's genetic stock composition data from the drift gillnet fishery, that generally speaking, if you look at the time series under consideration, that as I recall, harvest components are about I think 66% Kenai, about, I think, let's see, 12% Kasilof, and about 21% other. So, and again, there's uncertainty there, right? Those harvest components could be because aggregate other are harvested preferentially, not necessarily because it's the stronger stock, right? But I'm going to stop and ask for clarification on your question before I say any more words.
Well, I'll certainly grant you that within any management defined stock, there's parts of the watershed that are more or less productive for those. And but that's not the point here. The point here is that the agency's proposed, the SSC has reviewed and agreed that we're managing for 3 stocks. And we're not dividing it any further. And the information we have in front of us is that one of those stocks, aggregate other sockeye, has a much smaller minimum spawning stock size, only 163,000 compared to the 3 million for Kenai and compared to 500,000 for Kasilov. That's a much smaller stock. It's a much weaker stock as well. Those numbers also indicate contain a measure of productivity because the area that's covered, as your figures show us, it covers a large part of Upper Cook Inlet. So it can't be of the same productivity. But you're proposing, this is a large fishery. It's a mixed stock fishery. It's a first in time fishery. It's a fishery that largely occurs before the in-season run size update, if there can be one. And in this case, there really can't even be one. Is it prudent to set a harvest rate for this fishery that's based largely on the population dynamics of the Kenai and the Kasilov, but will have a profound impact on a broad range of sockeye runs throughout the rest of the fishery?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, you bring up some excellent points, and thank you for bringing up minimum stock size threshold, MSST. And we did not explain this, and I apologize for that. The MSST values are most certainly not comparable across tier 1 versus tier 3 stocks. So the tier 3 stocks, those MSST values are based on indices of spawning escapement, whereas the tier 1 stocks, those are more of a census of actual numbers of fish. There's inherently very, very different escapement estimates that you can make with tier 1 versus tier 3. Kenai and Kasilov are assessed via a sonar, whereas aggregate other sockeye, these tributaries and drainages are spread over a wide area. This value for MSST here includes only 4 of those. If we look at the map, well, we don't have sockeye up in the slide deck, but there are a lot of sockeye salmon stocks spread throughout Upper Cook Inlet, and only 4 of them have indices. Of those 4, it's highly likely that even the indices on, a given tributary is probably just that, an index of an index, because there are probably main stem spawners that are not captured in the weirs where these systems are. So long story short, MSST is not comparable because the tier 3 escapements are based on crude indices of an very unknown number of overall, well, maybe I shouldn't say very unknown, but they're crude indices of a larger escapement number that is, so represents that. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Sakata.
Yes, thank you. And through the chair, gosh, this is going to feel like I'm nitpicking. Probably not the right time of day to do it. However, I do have a question. As a federally managed fishery, I assume that state proxy fishing will not be allowed in the EEZ?
Through the chair, Mr. Sakata, no, we don't have proposed regulations for proxy fishing. So no, that is not contemplated.
Okay, it changes what I'm about to say by a magnitude of 2. I noticed that the aggregate Chinook salmon ABC that the SSC is proposing, the ABC is 270. I can envision sports fishermen catching 270 Chinook within the EEZ, especially off of Anchor Point, where the fish can concentrate in fairly shallow waters, even 3-4 miles out, therefore being in the EEZ zone. Do you, and this comes from experience as kayak fishing, so I think power boaters would even be more efficient. How do you plan on collecting information from sports fishermen in that area? I know it seems like, 0.01%. I agree it's a super low number, but those fish will definitely need to be counted if the ABC are 270. Do you have can you tell me how that might be enforced or those harvest numbers calculated?
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Sakata, thank you for the question. I believe it is section 4.6 of the analysis. We worked with Alaska Department of Fish and Game staff to estimate sport fish harvest for the EEZ waters of Cook Inlet. And the numbers that we estimated and that had been reviewed through that process were significantly lower. There's uncertainty with that. But based on the information that we reviewed, the area directly to the south of the Anchor Point line is heavily used by sport fishermen. The area the area south, as if I didn't say that. Once you go a little bit further north, there's much less harvest in marine waters.
As follow-up, I guess, yeah, my head hurts. It's a little too late. I have some concern about that, and the accuracy of that. I noticed somewhere in the report that they estimated 66 salmon, I believe, caught in that EEZ by sports fish. I can't say what year, but I'm pretty sure my group of 5 or 6 kayak fishermen that I often fish with easily exceeded that number. Maybe we should have commented. It just didn't even strike me, but I don't know what I'm trying to say here. So I guess I'm just a little concerned about how that number will be enforced, I guess. So that's a terrible question. My apologies. I guess you've already tried to answer.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, through the church. Thank you for the question. Yeah, and I think that's certainly we had the methodology that we used to estimate those. We'll reevaluate and work to improve that in future years.
Yep, Mr. Sakata.
I remember where I was going with that. I noticed that your regulations mirror the state regulations fairly closely. It doesn't talk about the Anchor Point or the Bluff Point line, but the state of Alaska, I believe, correctly so, does shut off the fishery that those regulations, at least in part, cover north of Anchor Point mainly. They shut down for conservation. Now, you wouldn't be able to match that. You're not trying to match state regulations on the fly. These would be permanent. And even if the state shut that fishery down, I could go into the EEZ and fish there.
Through the chair, Mr. Sakata, you're correct that we wouldn't necessarily do a closure just because the state did, but we do, in-season management does have the authority to prohibit retention or close fishing by the recreational fishery if it appears that that ACL is maybe exceeded.
And if the ACL is exceeded, do you just shut down the Chinook fishery or does everything shut down?
It would, for the recreational fishery, it would just be Chinook or whatever species was of concern.
Okay, let me think about that. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Sakata. Mr. Mesro.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both. I know this is a compressed time frame and a difficult issue. I just wanted to confirm, based on Mr. Sakata's question, his question was, how are you going to account for those fish? And you'll use a saltwater harvest survey and port sampling from the state is still going to be doing what they always do. It's just going to be a matter of either the angler or the port sampler asking the sport fish angler in which area they caught the fish. And if they reported in the EEZ, I would assume that that's how at the end of the season you would determine what the sport harvest was. And I would imagine that's how Fish and Game did it before you guys did it. Is that a correct assumption?
Through the chair, Mr. Mesro, yeah, that's correct.
It's Mr. Curlin.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Duncan, I guess I'm reflecting back on a number of questions that have come up this afternoon, thinking about Mr. Jensen's comment about over escapement, Mr. Twite's questions about how to deal with different strength of the sockeye runs, Mr. Sukata's questions about enforcement complications with the recreational fishery. So is it fair to say that all of these things are very germane to the council's tax setting discussion and essentially making perhaps qualitative determinations about how precautionary to be? What type of buffer is appropriate in setting TAC? Is that a fair assessment?
Through the chair, Mr. Curlin, yes, I think that would be very fair to say.
Thank you, Mr. Curlin. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. It seemed like we were coming to the end. I think a lot of the questions have been around the management program and the proposed rule itself. And I think at the front of the presentation, you mentioned, Mr. Duncan, that there, as is expected in a federal process, there could be changes between the proposed rule and the final rule. So are those, I think you characterize those as small. I know you can't speak to that directly on what changes you might be making, but I'm trying to figure out how the council understands what kind of level of change or opportunity for change there might be by the time the management program's actually in place. It's an awkward situation whereby we're proposing to take action prior to knowing what the management system is. Can you characterize the level of change that might be expected? I think Mr. Fortenberry would like to answer instead of you.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, I'm trying to save Mr. Duncan. Yeah, so a final rule has to be a logical outcome of a proposed rule. So that means that unless, you know, the change is something you could understand as something out for public comment, we couldn't make a change sort of beyond what was, I guess, the themes or the issues highlighted in the proposed rule. But in terms of the council's job here in tax setting, none of the changes, I think policy changes, should affect sort of what the council thinks is an appropriate harvesting level. You know, the means or timing or I guess some of those things factor in, certainly. But I think our hope here in this awkward situation we're in, where a court is forcing the council to look at specs before we have a final rule, is that we have to make some assumptions that the final rule will look something like the proposed rule generally, and that the changes you might see shouldn't affect the harvest specification process. To the extent they do, to the extent there's changes at the final rule stage that undermine any of the council's assumptions, that would be something we might have to revisit, which could also be awkward. But it's difficult to see how else to approach this given the court's pretty strict deadlines and the impossibility of finalizing the rule before this harvest specification process. Hope that helps a little bit.
It does. I appreciate that and the strange situation we're in for this. I wasn't positive that the final rule wouldn't change or affect the level of effort, or if you got a significant public comment, like I feel like I've been hearing in the other forums with the SSC and the AP on introducing the conservation corridor that the state had in place, or other things like that that might truly affect the level of harvest and effort. That I think is relevant to tax setting. So that's where I was asking. I don't expect you to have an answer for that since it's in the process, but that's where I was going with that.
Sure, through the camera, Miss Kimball, thank you. That's absolutely true. I think I would highlight that for most of the federal fisheries, we end up closing on TAC, not on anything else. So in the end, the TAC ends up being one of the primary methods of controlling total effort. You're right. I think timing and spatial distribution of that effort is something that theoretically could change. But I guess the council should keep in mind, total effort is usually constrained by TAC in most federal fisheries.
Thank you. And I'll stop. I think and where I'm getting at is if we're supposed to try to accommodate for some level of uncertainty in what this program looks like in a management system that is not as flexible as state management, that can only do openings and closures in season and that has a delay in doing that. I think that what we expect for effort and what's in place for the management system really can affect tax setting. So that I just want to explain that I'm not trying to make up a problem here. I think it's an actual problem. But I really appreciate your response and the presenter's difficult task. And I think this was a really helpful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mesro.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think my question's for Mr. Curlin. I just, since your presentation's almost over, we're probably going to break soon for the evening. And we have a number of comment letters from tribal members from the area, and they've come here a long way. And I know they're signed up to testify in front of the council. I'm just wondering if we can see if and Mr. Duncan did mention earlier on that there was some discussion prior to this with them, but not formal consultation. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess anything we can do to assure these tribal members that have come this long way that it was the agency's intention, to include them in this process, even if we're squeezed by the court to not get it in this time, that it's the agency's intention to engage with them and hear them out and give them a fair shake at what they're asking for.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Mesro, for the question. So yes, lots of opportunities for both engagement and formal tribal consultation. So these gentlemen went over briefly in the presentation some of the prior engagement that we've had, a number of kind of informal engagement discussions with tribal groups, as well as a few specific formal consultations, tribal consultations. We made some additional efforts to reach out at different junctures to offer opportunities for further dialogue, whether, again, informal engagement or formal tribal consultation. And then some additional requests came in rather late, and I don't remember the dates off the top of my head. It's in one of the slides. And at that point, just given where we are with the court-ordered deadline, we had to say, at that point, the agency just didn't have, we were not able to accommodate those requests within this cycle to be able to undertake tribal consultation relative to the potential formation of tribal fisheries, specific tribal fisheries, as part of this action. However, we notified the tribes that we fully intend to honor their request for consultation on that subject and intend to circle back with them, and that could be, in effect, a trailing action for the council, potentially to do a subsequent FMP amendment as needed to, if the council chooses to accommodate those requests. I hope that some of these folks who have made the journey here are signed up to testify tomorrow. So hopefully we'll hear from them as well as part of this. And I understand that the AP passed a motion to support a discussion paper specifically on that issue, on kind of scoping out. I haven't seen the AP's language, so I may be paraphrasing it incorrectly, but my understanding is essentially kind of scoping out what that might look like to some options if the council were to want to pursue tribal fisheries for Cook Inlet for the future. So I think there have been a number, just to sum up, there have been a number of engagements and consultations that have taken place, and there's more opportunity for that going forward.
Thank you. I just wanted to get this conversation on the record here so that, we acknowledge not only to these tribal members, but other ones who might be listening, that the intention is to fully engage them in the next go round of this program. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mesro. We can also bring up staff tomorrow if you're available for additional questions. That's possible. So we are very close to our typical breaking point of the day. I guess you can interpret that in a couple of different ways. But I've been asked by two testifiers to testify this evening because they have travel plans. So we will take those two testifiers and then we'll take the AP report first thing in the morning. Any other members wishing to sign up for testimony, please do so by the end of these two testifiers. And we'll be closing the sign up form at that time. So we have Jim Sykes and Marion Mills. So we'll start with Jim Sykes. Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the council. My name is Jim Sykes. I'm representing the Matanuska-Susitna Borough Fish and Wildlife Commission. In Matsu and additional areas, residents and economies rely on commercial set net, personal use dip net, sport fishing, and 4 indigenous communities have relied on salmon for thousands of years: Chickaloon, Connect, Eklutna Village, and Tyonek. Please review the documents we filed with this testimony, including the new 2024 update It Takes Fish to Make Fish, evaluating the current situation and Cook Inlet management proposals. Also, letters about Amendment 16 and Safe Report. And there's an interesting second look at some of the data in the Safe Report regarding possible overfishing on coho that may have occurred the last 3 years, from analysis of material in the Safe Report by Commission member Kendra Zamzo. Matsu has been applying conservation efforts to stem the declines of salmon and related economic activity for the past 30 years. We're talking about a long decline. We heard lots of testimony at our mid-December commission meeting from people trying to hang on in fishing and related businesses. We want to restore and conserve our in-river fisheries as much as possible to provide better fishing opportunities, restore economic activities, as well as returning more salmon into Cook Inlet. Not only do residents and businesses rely on salmon, our streams, habitat, and wildlife rely on the marine nutrients salmon bring into the Cook Inlet beluga whale, what the Cook Inlet beluga whale relies on. And if salmon are cut off at the EEZ, all of these things suffer. Slide 1, please. Our commission has worked very hard in support of scientific data that helps inform conservation and restoration measures. In 2014, the Alaska Board of Fish voted unanimously to establish a conservation corridor. The corridor simply moves fishing closer to shore for a period of time. After early sockeye and much of the late sockeye runs have come through, in order to catch a more stock-specific harvest of salmon, returning to the Kenai and the Kasilov rivers, while allowing better escapement for northern-bound salmon. This is one of the few opportunities we have to sort of select a specific stock. It appears to be working, and we want to keep growing progress that has been made, especially for sockeye. During the past few years, the Fish Creek personal use fishery has been opened every year, where previously it was only opened sporadically. We asked the council to expand implementation of this corridor concept and other effective conservation management strategies. As Amendment 16 is now proposed, there is an acceptable biological catch for an aggregate sockeye, which includes all northern-bound sockeye of 177,000 fish. We just saw it on the slide. However, there is only a single TAC of 1.3 million fish that includes the abundant Kenai and Kasilov runs, and that may have changed since we reviewed this. The EZ will only be closed when the TAC is reached. Because there is no way to distinguish northern-bound sockeye to the stock can be heavily overfished before a TAC is reached. While strong stocks can succeed with a significant MSY, the smaller and weaker stocks may suffer, which you just acknowledged. The actual returns of northern-bound sockeye or coho are only observed long after fish have migrated north of the EEZ. This is one major reason that fishing time and net size should not be expanded during this first year of management. maintain the status quo that appears to be helping northern stocks. While you develop methods and staff to distinguish northern runs from other sockeye in the EEZ, we ask the EEZ management to respect the conservation corridor by maintaining one 12-hour period per week for commercial gillnet fishing from July 16 to July 31, and extending that restriction through August 15th when sockeye runs are diminishing, but early and late coho runs are moving through the EEZ. This will help rebuild recent declines in coho runs that have shifted later in the season. We don't want to see coho follow the Chinook into oblivion. It's important to keep the drift gillnet length at 150 fathoms. No one knows how much more catch would be taken by the proposed additional 50 fathoms. The federal management plan said it would proceed slowly and with caution, and we agree. Adding more length to the nets in addition to doubling the drift gillnet fishing time does not seem either cautious or prudent. Our Commissioner Kendra Zamzo reviewed the SAFE document and data, but applied a different method to estimate possible overfishing. For coho, the data indicated probable overfishing over the last 3 years and possibly other years. For sockeye, the analysis indicated overfishing has not likely occurred. Because the same data can produce different results with different methods, additional caution and increased conservation measures are needed before there is a clear data track record with EEZ management. Serious risks and uncertainty posed by the current proposed plan cannot be understated. Allowing overfishing in the EEZ could adversely affect numerous stocks outside the EEZ. The TAC that is currently being calculated appears not to take into account a new in-season run that could be significantly outside current estimates. Additional precautions and conservation measures need to be implemented. The Mat-Su Borough Fish and Wildlife Commission look forward to working with you to ensure weak stocks have the opportunity to reinvigorate themselves to a sustainable level that enables Mat-Su, which hosts numerous natal spawning streams, to contribute more fish into Cook Inlet. If you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them. I'll bet you're really going to ask me a lot of questions, aren't you? Thank you all for very much for working on these difficult issues. It's a complex problem, and I don't think there's any easy answers. And I commend all of you for sitting down and trying to sort this out.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Sykes. We'll see if there are any questions. Mr. Twite.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sykes, for coming. Can you tell me just a little bit about the history of how the corridor was developed? It sounds like somebody recognized a problem, but I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about how that corridor proposal actually was developed.
It was developed before I became a part of the commission, but there was a concern over exactly, well, some of the Kenai Kasilov runs of plenty tended to do well when we tended, and the same year we would tend to do less well. And I think there was a move to try and stabilize it so that we knew that some more fish would go north. And it's not just for the Mat-Su Borough, but it's for the set netters and everybody else. And so our stocks were diminishing during that time. They have been diminishing since the 1980s. And, people used to actually come to Mat-Su to fish for kings. We could keep 5 a day at one point. Then it was 3, then it was 1, and now it's none. And so we don't have a commercial, we don't have an economic impact that we used to have. And so there was some way to try and figure out how to isolate the stock a little bit. And this concept, it didn't come from far away. They use it in Bristol Bay. And it's we call it the corridor because we've got a long inlet. And it does seem to work. We recognize that the drift fleet does not like to be confined to that area because they work about the same amount for less fish. But during the time that they're fishing in the inside waters closer to shore, where they're near the natal streams, then fish do pass north. And everybody has been doing better in the northern regions since we have been since the state has been operating the corridor. And so I think it's a very important tool. It may not be the only tool, but it appears to be doing some good. And conservation and restoration are both high on the list of both federal and state laws. And I hope that we can follow through on that.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. I had two questions. One was whether, the only action and the council can take at this meeting is on the tax. Did you provide those comments that you have within your written letter on the management system and the corridor and the changes that you see necessary there to NOAA for the
Yes.
proposed rule? Okay, that's my first question.
And we did not try to set the TAC. We do have two members of our commission, as a scientist, that's Kendra Zamzo, and Pete Basco has been involved in the federal fisheries for about 40 years. He was in Kodiak and knows this process. So we did go through these numbers, or I should say Kendra and Pete went through the numbers. When I see Greek mathematical equations, I just glaze over. But they tried as best they could to understand it and to make our comments appropriately, but we did not make any kind of assumption to set the TAC, because in essence, you're setting a number based on estimates that you don't have a real strong basis for at the present time. And so the only thing that we could really come up with is precaution, but asking us to set a number, we're not fish managers, we're not biometricians. And so I think that we're leaving that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your testimony.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify. Thank you.
Next up is Marion Mills. And after Ms. Mills, we will be breaking for the day. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Council, for taking the time for public testimony. My name is Marianne Mills, and I'm the Vice Chair for the Kenichi Indian Tribe in Kenai, Alaska. The Kenichi Indian Tribe is a federally recognized tribal government reorganized in 1971 under the Statutes of Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 as amended for Alaska in 1936. Kenichi currently has 2,023 enrolled tribal members who are Katnutana, Denaina, Athabaskan. Since time immemorial, Kenichi have lived in the Cook Inlet Basin and have relied on fish from Takatnu Cook Inlet to provide critical sustenance for our families, so that even today salmon remains central to the Kenichi culture and identity. The bounty from these waters provide not only highly nutritious food, but works to preserve the culture and traditions established by the early Denaina, maintains a sense of group unity as families and community members come together for the harvest and processing, and represents the resiliency of a people who have weathered much change in the millennia in which we have called Cook Inlet home. The current actions proposed by you, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NIMS under Amendment 16 to the Fishery Management Plan for Salmon Fisheries in the EEZ off Alaska, would implement federal management of commercial drift, gill net, and recreational salmon fishing in Cook Inlet exclusive economic zone for the first time in history. Kenichi believes that this unique moment offers an invaluable opportunity to more thoroughly consider how NOAA and NIMS and you can better fulfill their trust responsibility to the 8 federally recognized tribes, including Kenichi, who live in this region. Kenichi believes that a tribal fishing opportunity should be established in the soon-to-be federally managed waters of the Cook Inlet EEZ. As part of the Salmon FMP's overall conservation and management strategy, Kenichi's rights to our Traditional territories and resources are protected internationally under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and have been advanced within the United States as part of the Federal Indian Trust Responsibility, which is one of the most important principles in federal Indian law and is legally enforceable fiduciary responsibility on the part of the United States to protect treaty rights, lands, assets, and resources. The United States trusts responsibility to federally recognized tribes and the most important nation-to-nation consultations as the key means to uphold this responsibility have both been consistently reaffirmed, included in the 2014 U.S. Department of Interior Secretary Order Number 3335 and 2000 Executive Order 13175 and Presidential Memorandum of January 26, 2021. And again, as recently as April 2023 with Executive Order 14096 on environmental justice, which recognize the needs to continue to respect tribal sovereignty and honor cultural subsistence practices through means of meaningful consultation. As a historically underserved community with persistently high levels of social and vulnerability, Kanaitse further recognize access to these fisheries as a food security issue of critical importance. Subsistence food production ensures self-sufficiency and helps to reduce rates of poverty and hunger. Ultimately, our ongoing economic, social, and cultural well-being is intimately tied to these resources in ways that the Magnuson-Stevens Act own language suggests must be considered under the National Standard 8 and under the Salmon FMP's Management Objective 4. If the final goal of the Amendment 16 is to ensure that the Salmon FMP is consistent with the MSA, then the traditional use and subsistence rights of tribes like the Kanaitse cannot continue to be overlooked. The Kanaitse therefore requests that NOAA, NIMS, and you include a tribal fishing opportunity and related set aside in any fisheries management plan that is ultimately approved for the Cook Inlet EZ. As tribal peoples, we would hope to play an active part in ultimately shaping the exact contours of this opportunity, and we believe that NOAA's existing Alaska Subsistence Halibut Program offers an excellent initial model that we could collectively modify and build upon. Kanaitse looks forward to further engagement with your organization, which will work to uphold both our traditional rights to these resources as well as your federal trust responsibilities to the Cook Inlet tribes, who have long been stewards of these lands and waters and who will invariably be impacted by any management plan ultimately put forth. Thank you, Chignik.
Thank you for your testimony. See if there are any questions. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. And thank you for your testimony. I noted, and actually, I think someone from your tribe noted for us that that the advisory panel at this meeting passed a motion asking for a discussion paper to look at the opportunity that you've described. Is that, I think it's related enough to your testimony. Is that an approach that you support as a first step?
I support that as well as our tribe will support that.
Thank you.
Mr. Curlin.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Mills, for your testimony. So you may not be able to answer this, and if so, tell me. I'm wondering whether the Kanaitse have had the opportunity to discuss with other tribes interest in this type of a tribal fishery, and whether you would envision that ultimately there are common interests across tribes and how that might shape up, or maybe you haven't gotten to that point yet, but I thought I would just give you the opportunity to address that if you have.
many of the tribes in the Cook Inlet are very supportive of this, and they will be also testifying today or tomorrow. And because we were not consulted on this matter, we have not had enough time to come up with a decision. Our only ask here is to honor a tribal fishery in the EZ zone. Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you again for your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you.
We will break for the day and come back at 8:15 tomorrow morning. And we will start with our AP report and then continue our public testimony on C3. Thank you.